Over a year ago, emerging from the pandemic, a suitable agency began the series in collaboration with Sunder Nursery to celebrate the joy of books, reading, and meeting your favorite writers and hear them speak. And since then, we've been fortunate to have some of the most renowned writers and artists, as well as some most promising new voices, grace suitable conversation at Sunder Nursery. We are delighted to welcome you to our special session this evening, How We Tell a Story, features two immensely acclaimed writers, Janice Pariat and Aanchal Malhotra, who will talk to us about their latest books and the craft of writing. Just to quickly introduce our speakers, Janice is the author of both On Land, Seahorse and The Nine-Chambered Heart. Everything That Light Touches is her latest book. She is a recipient of the Sahitya Akademi's Young Writers Award and the Crossword Book Award for Fiction. She teaches at the Ashoka University. Aanchal Malhotra is a writer and an oral historian. She's a co-founder of the Museum of Material Memory and author of two critically acclaimed books, Remnants of a Separation and In the Language of Remembering. Both explored the human history of 1947 partition. The Book of Everlasting Things is her debut novel. Both the books you see here are there. The conversation today will be followed by a Q&A session, following which our writers will be happy to sign copies in case you brought them along. And I don't want to take any more time. I just want to thank our partners at Sunder Nursery, Ratish Nanda, Hardeep Ji and Nidhi, for helping us and put this together every time. Thank you, and over to Janice and Aanchal.
This is a really interesting conversation because Janice and I are friends, and until now, I don't think we realized just how much similarity existed in the way that we think about stories and characters and landscapes and just the craft of writing. And it was only by reading each other's books did we find so much resonance of theme and form, research style, and just the smaller things, I think. There's no real structure to this conversation per se. It's just a conversation between writers and friends. But I will start by talking a little bit about Janice's book, and then perhaps you can do the same, and then we can riff on.
Of course. I mean, just to add to what Aanchal was saying, we're not often, if at all, placed on panels together because, thematically it seems that we work in sort of disparate universes. But, I'm so glad that this has happened because it's given us a chance to actually discover that that's not true. And that also, it gives us a chance to talk about the things that we're deeply interested in craft, in writing, in clearly a lot of historical research. But these are things that perhaps don't quite, anchor that kind of space in other sort of literary, events. So this has been quite special.
And I feel like we should talk about that a little later as well. Yeah. Okay. Everything the Light Touches is Janice's fourth book. Doesn't that sound amazing?
I mean, I can't believe it either.
And at the heart, I feel like anyone who knows Janice sees why she's written this book, because it is such an ecological book. It is a book that I have notes. It is a book about our relationship to the earth, about living things and a deeper engagement with them. There are things about the book that remind you that just being in nature is not enough. One needs to have a conversation with nature. Also, nature as companion, nature as teacher, nature as keeper, nature as healer, nature as mother. But also, I think one of the strengths of the book in all the different sections of it is an effort to move against classification of things. And when I see it through a very broad arc, the book is really a mediation on our existence on this earth with other beings, using botany as a metaphor for that.
Really just as the most convenient of tools, although it did mean I had to do an extraordinarily large amount of research just to bring it into the book as lightly as possible. But you're absolutely right. And thank you for placing the book, for all of us in such a beautiful, beautiful way. And in this most beautiful setting. Oh my goodness, it's just really gorgeous. And you're so right. And, so poignantly, true. Your words are, because at the heart of this book is this defiance, is this gesture at dismantling, categories and lines and things that separate us and divide us. And then, of course, I'm wondering whether I'm talking about my book or your book. And I think
also about our practices, and how they've changed in the last 3 or 4 years since our last books.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think I read somewhere, or was it Karina who was saying this in one of her posts about your book, that, this was a novel that had actually emerged in your head as an idea, perhaps even before the non-fiction romance, So tell us about that. How did it stay with you for so long? How did it gestate while you were working on these other books? How did you carry it with you to today?
I think that carrying is the most important, because for me, I really envy people that can write books in very short spans of time. Because for me, every book of mine has taken 3 years, 10 years, 5 years. It's a long time. And I think in this kind of circumstance, you not only have to be very interested in your subject matter, but you have to constantly fuel it, right? And if I remember thinking of this idea in 2016 in December. That was even before Remnants came out. And it was because I was doing so much oral history recordings of people. And I'll speak a little bit more about this later, but through that research came an idea of having accumulated enough information about that time to start something imaginary, to create, this is what historical fiction is, to take real landscapes and create imaginary characters and understand the malleability of history, to be able to pull it apart and make the characters sit in it real enough to be absorbed into that landscape. But how do you write a novel? As someone, it's funny, like at the back of my head is always your theme of deconstructing categories, because it feeds so much into my work. I started as a printmaker, as a metal engraver, came into writing, and then moving genre. Did I know how to write a novel? Which actually brings me to you. How did you put together this novel? Because it's not just grand in scale. Like, I would say this is your most ambitious novel yet in terms of size, because ambition can be measured differently. I would say like The Nine-Chambered Heart was ambitious in a completely different way. But the characters, the themes, the questions that it asks, the themes that are larger than ourselves. And then there is a line in the book that says everything is entangled. As if you're braiding through, I'm going to say sweet grass, but that title's taken. Braiding through the story, and I know what it took me to put together a book like that. But how did you think of the scale of the book?
I think if I'd thought of the scale of the book all at once, I don't think I would have written the book, to be very honest. I think it would have intimidated me right then and there, and I would have said, I can't do this. What am I even thinking? I must be completely bonkers, and I'll just stick to writing something I can, imagine very quickly, very swiftly. And so, in response to you, I would say it took time, and it came to me in almost bite-sized pieces in some ways.
100%. What happened with you?
There's nothing comes fully formed. No, not at all. And so it begins in a garden, much like this one? Perhaps not. This was in the UK somewhere when I was still a student. And there was a tiny little exhibition in the corner of this garden that no one else was really paying much attention to. And it was an exhibition on women botanists. And, you know, I'm curious where this little idea for the novel came for you, but that's where it came, you know, from for me. The character of Evie, who you will meet in the book if you read it, she sort of emerged somewhere in my head, and I thought, oh, I'm sure she leads this wild and unruly life, and you know, she's a woman who's doing things that she wasn't meant to be doing at the time, and she's traveling. So
they're constantly reminding her of that as well.
Yes, of course, she's constantly reminded of that. Whether in the university or outside of it, she's not meant to be doing what she's doing. And I just knew that she was traveling. You know, the journey that Samir in your book makes from India to the UK, that's the journey she makes in reverse. And honestly, if there's a moment in our books that sort of touch very visibly, because there are moments that also, you know, sit together and intermingle at other points. But there is this journey that her character and my character make by sea. And I just knew that Evie was making this journey, and she was making this journey to India, to somewhere perhaps even closer to my home. And I wrote this book to see what she was looking for. And that's where it began. So the spirit of the book is driven by curiosity, by questioning, by inquiry. And that's very much what drives all the stories, the narratives within the pages as well. That spirit of adventure and that spirit of questioning and wanting to know more about the world, but also wanting to know more about your own self and your own place within this beautiful, you know, planet.
I think also the aspect of occupying space, like Evie's character is one of the most interesting for me, just because, you know, I've read Andy Corsi and the fishing fleet assassinating. I interviewed a lot of women that were a part of the fishing fleet. So for those of you, does everyone know what the fishing fleet was? No. Fascinating concept, really weird and sexist as well. It was a concept where during the British Raj, women, because a lot of men came over as officers, and they happened to be young and eligible, because to come to India was to make your fortune in India as a young officer of the East India Company or later the Raj. And so these young women who were left single, essentially, in England, would come over on these ships, and they were called the fishing fleet. And their motive, they would come during seasons. Like there were specific seasons where it would be very social and gentle.
Oh, winter.
Yeah, right. No, exactly. It was like husband hunting season. Yeah. And they would come to get married. And some of them would be lucky enough to find love on the ship. Right? Others would get through dances and balls and card parties and, like, you know, hunting and crocodile expedition and find love thereafter. But if you happen to not find love and go back to England, do you know what you were called? The returned empties. It's just, right? Terrible. So Evie comes to India as part of the fishing fleet, and there's this excellent book by Andy Corsi all about this.
So our research resources also overlap.
It was so similar.
Yeah.
This conversation we were having sitting here is basically like, how long did it take you to figure out how long the ship would take from one port to the other port? Because this is not available. You can't just put into Google and say, in 1911, how long did a ship take to leave Liverpool and reach in Calcutta or Bombay or wherever you were going? You know, so it's really, really fascinating.
Yeah, because you literally couldn't do that. So I had to sit with journal entries and count the days and then add up weeks and say, okay, 3 weeks. Why couldn't someone just say this?
No, it's like, here's Suez, here's and here's Marseille, you know? Yeah, same.
So did you have a little map on your wall?
Which I did. And I did lots of, I made lots of lists. Yeah. So because my book also goes back and forth in time, and two characters make the same journey across, well, one makes it in 1914, the other in 1948. Times have changed, right? So the knots at which a ship moves have also, this is also things to consider, historical research. So there were files and files of lines being like, okay, in Samir in 1948 is here on this day, but Vivek in 1914 is here on this day.
Yeah, crazy. I know. And I think what has really fascinated me about, the Book of Everlasting Things is how there is an incredible amount, of course, of historical research that you've done. But how do you know? How do you know that this is the detail you want to place in the book? There's this moment where, these two friends are drinking tea in Lahore. And there's just a few lines about how, tea had come to Lahore. And it's a very sort of brief little interlude. And I was thinking, I wonder how many books she read.
I spoke to someone. Dude, this is like, there are so many people who tell you that, again, talk about classification and categorization. To be a historian is not the same thing to be a novelist. I understand that, but having come from historical training, to be a historical novelist means that you can bring that kind of training and depth of research to your book. There's only good stuff coming out of that transition. And so to put a writer in one or the other box is really quite unfair and does injustice to the work
and diminishes them somehow.
You're telling me. That detail. Okay, so I feel like no one should ever discount oral history as a resource, because when it comes to immediately pre-independent, ethnographic landscape of India at the cusp of independence, it can best be understood through the stories of people, right? Yes, historical archive will give you one perspective. And I love how when people are like, oh, you sit in the archive, so what you record is history. What you record is only one version of that history told to you from a particular perspective, and usually of a victor, or in my case, it was the British writing those archives. So this is why I need to go to London to look at archives of my own country written by British men. But it was a self-published manuscript that someone I spoke to had written about his life. And he had this detail about how we associate tea with India. Like, it's like tea in India, yes, country, yeah. But it wasn't until like the 1930s that tea came to Indian households. And one of my protagonists is sitting with his friend Altaf. So Vivek is sitting with Altaf and they're drinking a cup of chai. And Vivek remembers how he first drank tea in the trenches of World War I in 1914. Which is where, as an Indian, he was first given tea by the British as a part of their ration. And I said, God, I have to just put that in somewhere. And it was because of overproduction of the tea leaf in 1930 that people from the Indian Tea Board would sit in different little cities of Punjab and hand out free cups of chai with a bun. There was a free bun as incentive. Ke tum piyo, fir tum jaake kharido,
Yeah.
And I remember that. Like, I had a lot of discussions with my editor about this because we both didn't want to let it go.
Yeah, no,
but glad you didn't, because I remember it so vividly. Right, but the detail just wouldn't fit anywhere. And so I had this little pocket of information, as I'm sure you had a lot of, you take it out of the narrative, you put it somewhere else, and you're like, okay, it's going to sit there until it finds a place, right? And I waited for a long time and it fit there.
Yeah.
But that's a delicious detail.
It is. It really is. But what is your process of deciding from this wealth of information? I mean, I'm always interested in the process by which these kinds of decisions are made, these very intentional authorial decisions. How do you decide from this wealth of information? Because you've done the kind of deep deep delving work of the time, of the period, of the issues. How do you pick? How do you choose?
Well, it's going to sound horrible. The structure of the book, because I come from oral history, one thing I've learned very quickly to do is to be organized in my research. If you are recording, say, 150 different people, they have to have a method of organizing them so that you can grasp the details of what they're saying. For me, the plotting of a novel was very similar. I, like you, cannot think of the large It's very daunting, and I'm not interested in thin. I'm not interested in meager, right? That's not enough for me. But I also know that ideas and worlds don't come to you fully formed. You need to work. You need to live. You need to, because a scene will be inspired by an event that has happened in your daily life, or you will alter something of what you've experienced, right? But what I do is think of a broad outline, divide it like you did into parts, divide those further into chapters, and divide those chapters further into parts. This sounds incredibly mechanical, but it's very helpful. Because then you're grasping one day, 1 hour, one particular year, one event at a time. But how, it's such a good question. How do you decide what stays and what goes, or what needs to be there in the first place is probably what puts forth the humanity of that moment, right? Because what I'm interested in is how people feel. What do they do? What do they hide? What must they hide? How has history lived them rather than the other way around? How do they defy? How do they love? How do they survive? Things like that, I guess. And then I think a lot of... I don't think I'm a very imaginative person, to be honest. I know it sounds ridiculous to say having written a historical novel, but I really don't think so, because I'm not interested in building worlds. Neither am I good at that. What I'm interested in is seeing how elastic the world already is, right? Why is inserting story into history the way we remember that history? I don't think that you would have remembered that little aspect of chai had you read it in a history book.
Probably not. I don't remember anything I read in my history books, to be honest.
Yeah, right. But I mean, similarly like you, like I've read Goethe in my undergrad.
Yeah.
I read Faust.
Yeah.
But there is so much about him here that I would have never known. And the question that I wanted to ask you is, and I know we talked about it briefly last weekend, is, as a young Indian woman, female writer, female novelist, right? Writing men, and not just, or writing women, Evie as well, from such a different, not just time period, but also gender and class and the gaze, such a different gaze, and the ownership over that landscape that they inhabit. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's similar to a question that I had for you as well, so we can go into that.
Women writing men?
Not so much, but just writing characters in different contexts,
Right.
and in very white Western
Yeah.
/ European context. So in Everything the Light Touches, there's a couple of pretty well-known real historical characters.
Yes.
You may have heard of them.
Maybe.
So there's Linnaeus, who's a Swedish scientist, a botanist. He was the father of botanical taxonomy and all of that. And then there's Goethe, who most of you will know as a poet, a playwright, this incredibly revered and well-known German literary figure, after whom all the Goethe institutes are named. So, he's one of those people. And there I was, standing precariously at the edge of, their narratives, and trying to will myself somehow to gather the courage to write these white male European characters into my book. And these are the stories I'm telling myself. Do I have the right to? How am I going to do this? There's such big names. And, the few friends that I had mentioned this to, not all, a few, looked slightly aghast when I confessed that, Goethe was a character in the book. So really, there was very little help from that area as well. So really, it was a question of gathering courage and in some ways realigning these narratives in my head, but also receiving a lot of help to do that by reading other books that had placed similar, if not the same, historical figures into their pages. So there's Milan Kundera's Immortality has a very wizened old Goethe who's almost a comic figure in the pages. You know, he's this very crotchety old man. He's well into his 80s and he's really grumpy. And I read this with such joy. And then there was another book by Daniel Kielman, also a German writer, called Measuring the World, which also includes Goethe in a few instances. And Goethe comes, enters a room, says something that nobody understands, and then drifts out. And I loved the way that they portrayed them with such sensitivity, yes, but more importantly, irreverence. And that's where I sort of gathered this courage from, to say, you know, this is what I'm going to do. Yes, they're huge and they're well known and so revered, but I'm going to treat them with some playfulness and some irreverence and make them human and make them sit on my pages as human beings who are a little pompous and a little self-absorbed and falling in love and being rejected and, you know, boring people and being in love with the world. And suddenly they became that much more human to me. I think with Evie, she is a fictional, white woman, and I think I found her so difficult to write because I wondered how I could possibly place myself in some kind of proximity, to her. And then I realized, well, actually, some of the things she feels, I feel, I want to put on a jaunty little hat and, go and explore the world like, most men can do. And I want to wake up in a new place and feel that kind of excitement and be pulled by journeys and newness. And, I think I understand where she comes from, this very gendered, very patriarchal academic space that has really not nurtured her in the way that she ought to have been nurtured, and the kind of nurturing that she finds in the wide open spaces of Cherrapunji, of Sora. She finds kinship on the other end of the world. So I think it was trying to keep these connections, these little moments of humanity alive between them and me that helped me write them. But I had really just the same question for you, because you're working also with characters who are in some ways quite dissimilar to our immediate context. And I don't mean just in terms of, Samir and his family, the Rich family, and, for those, because they are removed from us in temporality. But, when Samir does journey to France, and, he meets Leia, and he meets, the perfumer who had taught, I mustn't give away any spoilers, but I'm just interested in knowing how you conjure characters who are possibly not of the same sort of cultural context. Does it intimidate you too?
No, of course. I think the biggest, I think at some point, I know I am very unkind to myself if I'm not. That's the end of the sentence. Yeah. But I know that other people also are after speaking to you, because that need for authenticity is so desperate, right? And I think the only thing that can really quench that need is proper research. And Samir, when he does go to France, he does marry this, my protagonist, who is a perfumer. He travels to France and he marries this woman called Leia, and Leia is a nurse. She was a nurse during World War II, and I don't know what it's like to be a nurse on the front. I ended up reading a lot of memoirs that nurses wrote about seeing man after man after man, limbless, a hole in his body, guts gushing out, giving them false hope that you will live. And Leah is someone who eventually loses her fiance in that very same way. But it was, these are things, okay, you can imagine what it feels like to lose somebody. But The stuff that really got to me, and it sounds so insignificant as I'm thinking it in my head right now as well, is like, but what did Leah's uniform look like? And did she wear a cap? And was there a cross on it? And what color was it? And how will I find out these details? I don't know any French nurses who were alive in 1942. So it is a lot of research. It is a deep dive into these really weird meanderings and lanes and other people's lives, other people's private lives that they've written out as memoirs, not knowing that some young Indian writer, 5 days later is going to be reading it and it'll be deposited into another kind of book.
Yeah.
For the perfumers, that is a whole different kind of research.
Yeah. But exactly what I was going to ask. I'm so glad you've just preempted it, because perfumery in your book is, yes, of course, it's an art, it's a craft, it's all of those things, but it's also a language by itself. And to learn a craft is to learn a language. To learn an art form is to learn a language. To learn botany was also to learn a language, to be honest. But it is literally you sitting at the very beginning of things and gazing into this world and saying, how do I get to know you? How do I get to know you linguistically? How do I get the words right? How do I get the gestures right? And that's what I wanted to ask you about. How do you begin to know a language, make it your own in some way, and then with boldness, just, infuse it into a novel?
I would say the one difference in learning something like botany and perfumery is that you're either born as a nose or you're not, right?
And are you?
No, no, of course not. If you are, then you know it. If you aren't, then you know it as well. But how do you write about something that is invisible, that we do already? We smell. And we take for granted that we smell. There is no intention with our sense when we smell. We have a nose, so we smell. That's it. Imagine if you didn't have your sense of smell, though. I am not joking. All the joy from your life would be gone. You wouldn't be able to taste anything. How many times when we had COVID did we not smell what we were eating, or we didn't know when something is burning outside? Or, smell provides all infinite joy. Right? But it is the least understood of our senses, and it is the least appreciated as well. But how would I write about something that was invisible and esoteric, and yet at the same time had the most particular vocabulary? Now, when we think of novels around perfume, there's one that looms very, very big, which is Patrick Susskind's Parfum. And I did not want to write a second novel like that. So I also stayed completely away from reading it again in the last 6 years. Because it's not, you may not pick up the broad themes, but you will certainly pick up the small descriptions. And you won't even realize that you're doing it, because it'll come so naturally up to your own vocabulary.
Yeah.
What I did instead is to shadow a perfumer for 5 years. Her name is Janvi Nandan. She runs something called the Perfume Library, and she lives between India and France and now Portugal. But she was straddling two different kinds of worlds of Indian perfumery, which is so rooted in oil-based delight, and Western perfumery, which is alcohol-based and now so much based on synthetics.
Yeah.
And shadowing her was not just asking her questions, but it was literally seeing the way she moved.
Yeah.
Seeing the way she smelled things. We would walk in Paris and she would say, "Oh, did you smell those peaches?" And I'm like, "Of course I didn't. What do you mean? Where are they?"
What peaches?
It was a man's fragrance. As he walked by, she goes, can you smell the walnuts? No, there are no walnuts in this tea. And yet, there are hints of things we don't deduce, right? we smell a rose and we expect it to smell like a rose because since we are young, we know what a rose looks like and we know what it's supposed to smell like.
Yeah.
But try to take apart the rose. A rose smells like lemons. It smells like cloves. It smells like benzoin. It smells like all of these incredibly, almost chemical, minute details, right? It's kind of like plants in your book, right? Or actually the structure of your book. Like every layer lends to the other and does not take away from it, but keeps giving in some way, right? This is how a perfume is composed as well, with notes. So it was literally just shadowing her, understanding the way she lived and existed in the world, to be conscious of smell and to not be assaulted by smell. And it was just recording everything she said. We were on a bus in Paris and she said something completely mundane about the weather and I was like... So I think a lot of the conversations, there are a lot of perfumers in my book and they learn from each other. Samir learns from his uncle Vivek. Anik learns from Samir. Edouard Deroze teaches Vivek. A lot of the conversations that the perfumers were having were conversations I was having with Janvi. And the specificity of her vocabulary, what is a creamy smell? What is a cloudy smell? How does a rose smell milky? Why is a jasmine sweet? Why does something smell camphorous? Why does cucumber leaves smell different than a cucumber? Things like this. And there was a lot of smelling, of course. It smelled a lot, yes.
But I think this is what's so interesting and also overlapping between perhaps our research processes, in that it's very experiential.
Yeah.
So while you were shadowing a perfumer and smelling everything, I was desperately trying to grow plants and failing mostly, because how many of us truly keep our house plants alive and thriving? Not me.
No, it's just sitting there. They love it.
Is she very good with plants?
No.
Oh, right.
No, none of us are. And we just we're begging them every day. Another day. Yeah, basically.
Yeah, so that was my adat. I was trying to coax these succulents and prickly pears and anything that was green and growing into life. But I think it's the experiential aspect of research that, I don't know, just bolsters or uplifts.
I feel like if I don't know what it looks like or what it feels like or what the color is in my hand,
what it feels like.
How it grows, the time it takes, I'm not going to be able to write about it.
No.
Yeah.
It was the same for me. I had to actually observe how a plant turns towards the light in order to be able to speak about it in some way
And
in the book.
There's a small instance in your book with Goethe and his friends, right? Where they're like, why does this plant grow more or less than the other? Began the light, right? And it was basically like, it reminded me of biology class.
Yeah. It's the simplest observations that we make, but we don't quite think why they're happening. We're so used to really just taking in the green around us without really observing or paying attention. And I'm hoping the book in some way nudges you or suggests that you do that you pay attention, because paying attention, and I think it's the same with your novel, paying attention is love.
Yeah, I think there's also a really lovely slowness to both books.
Yeah.
I don't think they're supposed to be hungrily devoured. I think they're supposed to be quietly savored, because so much is so mundane. But I remember making so many underlines in your books because they were things that they were so true. Like, not just about plants and nature and the world, but also things like there is this tiny little line where Edie says of her grandma Grace, knowledge is hierarchical.
Yeah.
And I thought so much of oral history and how people give so little emphasis to anything related to it, because how can you prove it?
Yeah.
What is the veracity of one's memory?
Yeah.
And yet, so much of our book is comprised of language that is not verbal.
Yeah.
a kind of non-verbal, gestural
theory and
yes. And the importance of that in cultures like ours.
Absolutely. And, there was a point at which I, just to go back to, what you were saying about oral history not really being considered authoritative, there was a little course that I used to run at Ashoka called The Spoken and the Sung, Exploring Orality. And, we looked at a number of texts. We really sort of, tried to study what it was about the spoken and the textual that, had created these hierarchies, right? And the written, the textual has always been, and I don't quite know why we didn't hit upon this right at the beginning of semester, but the written, the textual script has always been a masculine space. The oral, memory, telling has been feminine. And from there, you can gather
so much, like people telling me I write soft history, or, of course you're a woman, so you understand what, kind of stuff.
There you go.
But there are lines that I've written down from their book that really resonate. Not everything that can be read is written on paper, right?
Here. The world is story, the world tells us stories all the time. In fact, one of the books that I read and reread over and over for Everything the Light Touches is Indica, Pranella's Indica, A Deep Natural History of the Indian Subcontinent. And if you read that book, you come to realize that all around you is story, and it is the earth telling the story of its creation, of its incredible adventures along the way through volcanic activity and ice ages and dinosaurs and all of us, our species, and what kind of, impact we have had all this while. It is constantly telling our story, and I think, this is why in some ways we write, because we are hoping in some way that these stories, these unsaid, unwritten narratives change us, transform us, infuse us in ways that that instill, gratitude, humility, some kind of sense of the world has so much to teach us, and that's why we're here.
I had a question for you, Janice. Was there... This is something I'm very interested in, having not understood how to write fiction, then written a novel, and not knowing whether I'm ever going to be able to do it again. Was there any character in your book whose trajectory surprised you?
I think I knew in some ways at some point in the writing process, because it takes very long, as you know, it's draft upon draft upon draft. But I wrote the book backwards. So I started with Linnaeus, who's right at the center, and then moved on to Goethe.
So how is that? It's like, it's actually the right way to write.
It is linearly written, yes, but in terms of structure.
I meant like if you think of bud to
flower,
yes, it's the right way.
Like that way as well, yes. But the way that you encounter the stories, that's not how I wrote the book. So I started with Linnaeus, Goethe, Evie, and then Shai, who, is our closest contemporary, who so many people have asked if she's me. No. But she, she's here and now, and you would imagine how easy to write a character who is here and now rather than someone who's wandering around Lapland in 1732. Oh my God.
I don't know. The thing is, it depends on what they've left behind. To work from archive is sometimes, it's because it's so much information that you already have. And if it's journal and memoir, then it's usually a lot of like random stuff.
It is true.
That they want to preserve, but don't know one else is going to read, but it's actually quite helpful.
Yes, it's
Right?
true. This book was double the size at one point.
Same.
And then there was a lot of subtraction. Yes, exactly. But Shy was difficult. I couldn't find her voice. I couldn't find her inner landscape. I couldn't find her motivations. And those are really important when you're writing character. Because a character doesn't come from some kind of vacuum. They grow within a very particular context. They are shaped by that context. Whether that context, looms large in the story or not, it's really important for you to understand where this character has emerged from. So Shy gave me a lot of trouble because I think sometimes the closer we are to characters, the harder they are to write. So I had no idea really what she was doing on the page. And, I sort of just listened and in some way let her roam the pages and find her own way. But she was stubborn, and I had to go through quite a few drafts in order to hit upon the Shy that, has emerged now, the Shy that is inspired by geology, who thinks of the world and her space in it, her place in it in terms of almost cosmic time. She tries to make sense of her own little life through these vast geological analogies and timescapes. And then she emerged as the Shy who could cradle these other stories within that vastness. But it took a while. She was very difficult to bring alive. Was that something you faced with any of your characters as well?
Well, the major landscapes of my novel are World War I and the Indian soldiers that fought in the war, partition, which I knew very well, and then migration
Much
to the West,
later, yes.
post-war France.
Yeah.
And I thought, well, being a professional historian, I feel like I should start with the war because there are archives and there are letters, and there are hundreds and thousands of letters that Indian soldiers wrote. Yeah. When they arrived in France in 1914, the Indian soldiers was writing up to 15 to 20,000 letters a week.
What?
As men, they were mostly illiterate, but they were not non-literary. So they employed scribes, and the letters that they write are hugely poetic.
Yeah.
But the context of those letters, war, bombardment, was just thankfully something I had never experienced. So I remember when I was writing those chapters, it was very difficult for me to get into the mindset of my protagonist Vivek, who goes to war expecting something, receiving another kind of reality altogether, and then finding a way to make the most of it or stay alive, really. And I remember our house was being renovated at that time, and walls were being taken down, and drills all day. And I was like, oh, this is great. Yeah, use that sound, use the experience of a method kind of writing to be able to help you, aid you in providing that kind of landscape. But I feel like it was really difficult for me to write about a period of history which had so much available already to me, but required so much more imagination for me to infuse humanity into that situation. Because when we think of war, we don't think of the soldier thinking about his Shenai, or the soldier writing home and saying, I hope you're taking care of my parrot, or the one trying to fix like a land dispute in France, all the way that's happening in like Montgomery, saying, well, it's okay, give him 20 acres, stuff like that. They're doing all of that.
It's almost as though time and lives stop, but they don't.
They don't, right? So the guy is like, I'm here, writing to his wife. He's like, I don't care about your land disputes. Don't tell me. There's nothing I can do here. But they're keeping track of their lives back home because time does not stop for them in both ways, right? They're living two lives. And so it was very difficult to have that authenticity of time period and yet still have the humanity that the men felt, because I know more about that time now than they did living in it. So a historical narrative is an interesting and quite tricky one, because you must only include that information that what character knows at the time, which means it's frustrating that you know that they wouldn't have used this kind of gun, but the one that they use, or the fact that they came wearing khaki or stuff and didn't know when they would get new uniforms or what they ate and stuff like that. I feel like that building that kind of world that was so different from mine and any kind of warfare that happens today, I think that was the hardest. I didn't expect it to be. I thought it would be a lot easier.
Yeah. No, I completely understand what you say, especially about historical detail. There was a point at which Goethe in my book mentions photosynthesis, and it hadn't been discovered yet. And thankfully, a botanist took a look at the manuscript before it was published and said, no, he wouldn't have known about this.
Been there.
Oh my
many,
God.
Too many like materials where like a perfumer's like, nope, cumarin has not come yet. Nope, sorry. She would not have worn it in a chignon. She would have worn a bun. And I was like, of course. What's the difference again?
Huge.
Obviously. No, she's like, well, chignons only came into existence in 1950 or something. I'm like, and where are we in 18 what right now? So, I mean, also to your point of other people helping to build that narrative, right? It's impossible to think that you can not only envision it, but also carry it and execute it. Like, there are conversations I've had with my Dutch translator. And I know that we've had this conversation on the specificity of language, but sometimes when we were speaking, she reminded me 291 days, she would ask questions about the language that I had used to write my sentences, which of course was in English, which is my first language. But it is language that I also take for granted. And she would say, well, do you mean this instead of this? And I said, actually, you're right. I do mean this instead of that because it is a more specific way of thinking rather than a vagueness, because for translation, she needs that kind of specificity, not just in the formal you versus like informal you, but also in everything, in doing, in action, in verb, and thought, right? So you cannot work in a vacuum either, even though writing is such an isolating craft.
Yeah, it can be, but it is only through extraordinarily collaborative effort does something like this come into being. And I mean, not just conversations with friends and other writers and editors and publishers and, academics and people involved in any way in the actual editing and printing of this. But beyond that, it extends so far and so wide. I mean, I love also, and I'm just going to ask you one more question. I don't know how we're doing for time. I'm quite happy to sit here all evening.
Oh, just that's it? Okay.
Oh my God. I have so many questions.
I know, same,
but let me first. Okay. I love all this talk of specific little details, all of that, but also what really stunned me about the book was your boldness with this kind of vast vision of imagining a character from almost his birth. So Samir is, he's 10 when we meet him at the beginning of the book. And a story that spans a lifetime. It's something that I haven't learned how to do yet. My character.
A second.
No, but it's very hard to do this. Aanchal has this, sort of casual sort of way of beginning
casual about it.
We're beginning a paragraph with 5 years later, and I'm like, how does she do this? How does she do 5 years later? Because I think my narratives are so much more condensed. It's the only way that for me I can imagine a character and a narrative unfolding. So Shai is about 6 months, Goethe is 2 years at the most, Evie is again 6-7 months, Linnaeus is a few months, and I think in those condensed, I mean, they might be, so generously, as you said, okay, wide in scope and all of that, but in terms of temporality, I'm working with very short time periods. But how do you do the 5 years later?
It's a lot of list matching. No, but it really is. I knew already the 2 of my characters, we follow them from birth to death. But that's the hardest. You're right. It's very, very, very hard because I guess what am I trying to say? We want every scene to be meaningful. We want every scene to be like that punchy kind of scene that's going to mean something deeper, and there's layers underneath it, you know. But she may just actually be cutting a cucumber. That's it. You know, that's it. She may just be making raita. She's just looking up at the sun. It's not the sun with the memories of, you know, something.
Yeah.
I think this is it, like coming to terms with also the mundane banalities and saying this is as much a part of your life. Like, it is very hard to follow a character.
It's very courageous.
I don't think it's courageous. Like, and I don't know if I'm really successful in it or not, because I know that not every part of their life would be believable to everyone. It's like when you read a novel, you read it with what you know about the world inside yourself, right? But I think I wanted every part of their life to be as authentic as was possible, which also meant modeling it or borrowing from people in my life that were those ages at the time, right?
Yeah.
The other thing I think was very complicated for me was being in every character's head. Every single character. You did the same. You did the same, right? Because when you look at like the trajectory of, say, Linnaeus from someone like Shai, it's so different. Linnaeus has a kind of, yes, he's an explorer. There is a sort of vagueness to his journey, but there is a specificity in what he's looking for and what he's writing. Whereas Shai is so lost. Shai is so lost. And it hurts her that other people see it.
Yeah.
On multiple occasions, her ex-boyfriend says it to her.
Yeah.
Her mother says it to her.
Yeah, all the time.
My mother's sitting here.
My mom isn't.
But I think it was like, to build a day is hard enough, right? Because so much of our day is just hanging out, right? But to build a life and follow it and do it justice and believe in the life at the end also, to give every day meaning, every scene meaning, is very difficult. So it was a lot of reading and, well, I guess reading about other people's lives in those situations at that age. But I think also, I don't quite understand how ideas come. Obviously, they come from somewhere. They come from connectedness to your present day.
Yeah.
But they come to me right when I'm falling asleep, or they come in the shower, and it's a lot of like voice notes, but it would be prompts. Scenes come as prompts to me. And then you sit and you think, well, where can this prompt go? Where has it been? Where is it? Where are the many trails that it can lead, you know? But I don't think it comes from nowhere, you know, where does a novel come from?
No, not at all.
But yeah, no, it is very hard to write from birth to death.
Yeah, but I find it very moving to follow a character from almost birth to death. It's something that I hope. Yeah.
How do I, like, the main character, Samir, yes, we follow him from very young to very old, but there are moments in his life where I don't like him. He becomes the man that women hate. You know, he becomes the man that, you know, you're like,
but that is life.
That's life, right? That's what I'm saying. That's life. So there are times in Firdaus does things that go against the betterment of her life, and you don't really expect her to do that. But I think she was someone that demanded more space on the page. I was never going to give her so much space, and
I'm glad you did.
Well, I think I could have actually given even more, you know, but she was always going to be someone in the shadow a little bit. And through the writing, this is why I was asking whether there was something about a character that surprised you, because I did not expect her to be so authoritative in the space that she occupies, which I think is a huge learning for me as well, to ask for something, you know,
for all of us.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I don't know if we're meant to maybe pause and open up to questions. Yeah. All right. Okay.
Well, okay. So I had a question about Linnaeus' section. It is the most interestingly written section because it is made up of letters or a memoir.
It's taken directly from a memoir, from a travel memoir that he wrote, that Linnaeus wrote when he was 25. It's really young. It was his first solo trip anywhere. So, I think we can all imagine being 25 and setting out to see the world and feeling as though our whole lives lay ahead of us in infinite sort of, potential and possibility. So that's the moment that you encounter, Linnaeus. He's off, and you encounter his narrative through lyric verse, through poetry. And it's very deliberately done for many reasons. One of them is because I spent a lot of time reading Linnaeus. I might have really been the only person on the planet still reading Linnaeus.
But you didn't entirely agree with him either.
No.
Right, that makes it harder.
No, I really distrusted him because he
Not even what I was thinking you would do,
among other things.
Like the father of botany, I don't really trust you that much. You at all. After. Let's see what Goethe said, actually.
But he stands for a way of seeing in the novel that I don't quite feel comfortable with. This very analytical, very with a great focus on categorizing and labeling and boxing. And so I was all set to really truly dislike him. And then I read his travel memoir and thought, actually, he's much more complicated than that. He's like me, filled with wonder at the natural world, and I can't bring myself to completely detest him. But I did read a lot of his other works, his lists, and they loved his like poetry.
Lists? You're reading his list?
I was reading his list of the natural world. That's what he did. He made lists of lists. He made lists of people who made lists. I mean, he was obsessed. He was.
I find that really comforting. Sorry. I'm sorry.
I think what's more disquieting is that it kind of spilled into the whole colonial project after that.
Right.
Exactly. But his list looked like poetry. The way they sat on the page in format and appearance. And I thought, well, what better way to disrupt a novel space, a novelistic space that's trying to question category than to insert right at the heart of the book a space of lyric verse. And so when you come across it, as I hope you do at some point, you think, wait, hang on a minute, what am I really reading? Is this a novel? It's urging you to maybe think about what is a novel then, right? Is this a novel? How do we define a novel? How do we define anything really, right? So that's where sort of the impetus, the motivation to render Linnaeus in the way that I did came from.
Through a really unique kind of poetry.
Erasure. Right. Yes. So erasure is a technique which you might be familiar with. It's a form of poetry that works always with a pre-existing text, right? So you're always using a text that's already there, it's already in existence. In this case, it was his memoir, his travel memoir. And in some forms of erasure, you have actual blackening out of text. So what remains on the page, the words that you see, form the new poem. This was a gentler intervention. I took his journal entries and rewrote them, had a little conversation with them, and rendered them as poetry. But the thing about erasure is that the existing text, the original text, will always continue to haunt the new work. So it's telling us that in the lives that we lead today, in the world that we live today, the way that Linnaeus, saw, his perspective, his way of seeing, perhaps still haunts us. We haven't quite moved away from this, need to categorize, to define, so sort of,
Structure.
Yeah. Exactly.
As I was reading his poetry, the one thing I was reminded of was when the soldiers wrote their letters, they were censored.
There you go. That's where erasure actually emerged from.
There were lines that were cut out, and this happened to all of the colonial troops, not just India.
Yeah.
Because they couldn't give out details of where they were.
Oh my God, there you go. So erasure poetry actually emerged as a form of protest poetry from inmates at jails and who were imprisoned and whose letters were censored. That's how erasure poetry emerged.
Thank you so much for a lovely conversation. I'm sure we all are loving it and we want to continue. But just in interest of time, I'll just open it out to questions from the audience, of course.
Hello, ma'am. Thank you for the lovely session. I'm Anjali. I'm doing PhD from Delhi University in Political Science. So my question to Aanchal ma'am. Ma'am, since both of us are from academic backgrounds, I just wanted to ask you, at what point of time and how did you realize that you want to embark your career into fiction? Because I am usually into fiction, reading fiction and trying to write fiction, but since there is a tussle between if you really want to take that risk in life that you have to, let the research part or the academic part go and just creatively explore the fiction and let your creative self be. So at what point of time, sorry if it's a very personal question.
It's not. It's such a relevant question. It's a question that haunts me. When people are like, "Oh, I love your nonfiction. Why are you doing this again?" Or reviewers say things like, "Writer of nonfiction, fiction, not so much." Stuff like that. So I feel like a lot of it has resonance to do with what Janice was saying about categorization of the mind as well. I did not come from an academic background. I came from the world of art. I trained to be a printer. I was an engraver. I was in the studio. And then to make that shift to writing was already such a big leap. But no one said anything then. But now when I make it from serious nonfiction to fiction, soft history, right, to fiction, the question is why. The question in my head is why not? Because if I were writing something like archival history or review academic history, it would have been different. But I don't really see such a difference in the way that I'm writing because it still functions on a very human level. You're still interested in the humanity of the everyday and of historical characters and events. But I think the question we should be asking is why fiction? What is it about nonfiction that we are not, how do I say this? What happens to language when it moves from nonfiction to fiction? What happens to the intention of the idea? What are you writing for? Why are you writing nonfiction? What are you hoping to gain by moving when you write fiction? What is it about the fictional idea that a nonfiction medium cannot give you? And I think all of this can only be answered by trying it. It may or may not work for you, but I feel like for me personally, when I was writing nonfiction, which I still do, it's not that I've given it up, because I was writing about real people and their real lives, there is very little you can alter. You cannot play with the way in which people have experienced life, and you certainly cannot edit the parts of their life that they are giving you. But with fiction, the freedom to alter narrative, to mold, to morph, is just a bit more liberating. You see, I could not have written fiction without nonfiction. So I don't want to say that that medium is now inaccessible to me because it very much feeds in to writing fiction. But I think that there is not much distinction in the manner of thinking and writing. The difference is in intention of why you write one or the other.
Hello. Hi, Janice. Question is to you. I really enjoyed reading everything the light touches. I had a lot of fun, and I also highlighted a lot of sections because I was like, oh, this is great read. Sometimes it was just the language which was me. But what I wanted to ask was there were a lot of themes that the book covered: environmental, gender, plant, the botany aspect itself. So how conscious were you to include certain themes? Because there were a lot of themes, but it went in wet and it didn't seem like, you're trying to fit things in. So I like that a lot. I just wanted to know how conscious were you to include these things?
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that really lovely question. And I'm so glad you enjoyed the book. At the heart of the novel, and you might have heard me saying this already, so forgive me, I'm repeating, but it is the heart of the novel. At the heart of it lies a tussle between these two ways of seeing the world, right? This very fixed Linnaean, let's categorize everything, let's box everything, let's label everything kind of way of seeing. And there's the Goethean and the shy way of seeing, which is more fluid, more unified, more holistic, more unbound, right? And I think this tussle shows up in many, many spaces. So at the heart of it lies this. Think of it as the point at which a stone drops into a pond, right? That is the heart, and the ripples around it are all of these themes all of these spaces rather, that experience that tussle. So, for example, the spoken as opposed to the text, right? An eco-feminist way of understanding and being in the world as opposed to a deeply patriarchal, way of doing science, right? Of national borders being calcified and unmovable, as opposed to a community that acknowledges no borders, that roams freely with their livestock. They're nomadic, they're pastoral. So these tussles show up in all of these spaces, and I like to think of them as wild spaces in the text, of spaces that can't be tamed and shouldn't be tamed, because to tame is also to control and to take away life, to deaden, right? And so that's why that heart of the book translates into all of these different spaces that you've observed.
Hi. So, my question, it had its origins in one of the papers that I was writing on Taib Mehta and partition. And from therein, I would like to bring it in that in a present age where 75 years of Azadi becomes more important and there is a very conscious sense of riding a roughshod over and inducing a historical amnesia by those in power. And on the other hand, there is a very classist interpretation of history. Therein, how do you, if I am to borrow the title of the talk, how do you tell a story in the present term? And to come to you, ma'am, since the form that you spoke of in the last thing, which I was so interested about in your book, Everything the Light Touches, the form of the poetry and how it sort of challenges the definition of novel writing. So how do you think you navigate this space of a historical amnesia being induced at one point, of a particular very strong sense of form and form building in place that does not want to take into account the diversity of voices that is in there, and this entire thing of reinterpreting history from a very classist point of view? How do you then tell a story?
I think the one thing I realized very quickly while writing on partition was that there is no one way to tell that story. There's no one way to tell that story. There's also no one way to receive that story. Every story you hear, you will gradually unlearn something, a prejudice, a bias, an othering you didn't even know you had. So for me, it has been a slow understanding of the fact that there is not just one national project at play, but multiple. 3, 4, I would say. Britain, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh. How do we tell a holistic story of decolonization using 4 different perspectives. I think you cannot do it through one single archive. You cannot do it through looking at only an India-centric way, which is really what South Asian politics really is. It puts India at the center where it really shouldn't. It must consider other aspects as well. But I think it is through people's stories. That's what I have learned, that 2 communities, maybe they're of the same religion, maybe they're of the same, let's say 2 families. Maybe they come from the same place, maybe they're the same religion, maybe they're the same caste and class, will still have differing stories to tell of the same event, not just at the moment, but its long-term impact as well. So only by recording a plethora of stories can we build a fuller story of a particular moment in time. That is by recording the Pakistani experience, Pakistani Muslim, Hindu, Christian, Parsi experience, the Hindu experience, the Muslim experience in India, same, the Christian, Parsi, all kinds of different tribal experience. Partition is not just limited to Bengal or Punjab, dominated by Punjab though, but it equally belongs to Gujarat, Rajasthan, Kashmir, the Northeast. Where did NRC come from? Came from Assam in 1951. Why did it come? Its roots are in partition. It is something that impacts us till present day. But I do think, one of the biggest questions people ask me as an oral historian is like, how can you trust people's narratives, right? This is what we were talking about with archives. But I feel like oral history, maybe it has its weaknesses, but its strength is in its diversity of storytelling. It understands and acknowledges that there are communities of people that the national project has erased or overlooked or rendered invisible. And by allowing people to speak for themselves in their own voice, in their own language, you're allowing them also to inherit that story that they have lived, to take ownership of that history. So I'm a huge proponent, obviously, for oral history. That is, in my opinion, the one way. But you cannot you cannot ignore archival history either. They have to. It's communicative. It has to work together.
So both of you mentioned the process of writing characters authentically. So I was wondering if, in the quest of understanding the emotionality of your characters in an accurate manner, do you think the characters somehow end up writing you? Like, how much of yourself changes after the process of writing a book or writing a particular character?
Yes, go ahead. It's such a lovely question. Thank you. Because we often think that we are the poet, and I'm using the poet in its most sort of perhaps ancient sort of form as one of the maker, the creator. And yet it's also the poetry that creates art, and this kind of duality, I think, is what is required for a text to emerge from between this dialogue, this conversation, this dance, this tussle as well sometimes, right? I remember while writing this book, we were in the midst of lockdown, okay? And it's a book about travel. It's a book about travelers. It's a book about setting out to see the world. And I was sitting at my little desk in our 9th or 8th month of
I remember you being in Italy at the beginning, right?
Oh God,
that whisked back home.
That's another story. I was following Goethe, and then the pandemic happened. And anyway, so I was there at my little desk writing about traveling and travelers and using travel as this wonderful vehicle to explore this fluid way of seeing while more addict. But perhaps that also infused the narrative with some kind of urgency, that kind of longing, perhaps even, right? And alongside that, there was this little garden that I had the utmost privilege to have access to, where I had a few plants that now I was forced to look after, poor things, but I managed somehow. And in those months of being cooped up and, having nowhere to go, a time when we think of as one of diminishment, of constriction, of physical sort of immobility, I realized that, and this came only after a while, I realized that the plants in this little patch of green were incredibly, wonderfully connected to the world. They were in tune with the shift in seasons, with the play of sunlight, with the wind, with day and night. And even in their stillness, they were transforming. And I thought, maybe here's a lesson for me. And would I have come to see that if I wasn't writing the book? I don't know. Or would I have been writing the book without seeing that? I don't know. But it's a process that is so, at its heart, almost mysterious. You can't quite put a finger on it, and maybe we shouldn't. Maybe we can't even try. But there is this incredible duality that, that I think you tend to encourage without even knowing it, while writing, at least while writing a book like this for me.
Did that conversation not make its way into Moritz and Goethe as well?
Right? I think that's a way of trying, right? Yes, a tiny bit of it. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you still want to hear from me? I don't know. I was there transfixed by what you're saying. Do they live you? Sometimes I think that if I met my characters in real life, and it's crazy to even think that thought because they don't exist. But sometimes I think if I met some of my characters in real life, they would be very unhappy with me. No, because not every character is equal. You have 4 protagonists. I have many secondary characters that get dealt the shorter end of the straw. And I think to myself that yes, not every character is equal, but you have to go through the charting of characters to realize that. And you're making choices. How much of life, how much of goodness, how much of anything do you want to give to somebody, right? And there are certain characters that I think, but that's life. That's how life is, right? Everything cannot be beautiful and rosy and work out. But I felt like they were determining their actions as I was writing them, rather than the other way around. This is what I was saying earlier about characters surprising you by the trajectory they choose to take. There is a scene I remember writing with a totally insignificant character, kind of like a bigot, right? I had a preconceived bias about this character, so I didn't realize in my mind that I was going to kill him. But there is a scene where he dies a really bad death, right? But that was not my intention. It was just that I hate your thinking so much. Oh, look. No. So obviously I'm saying it in a humorous way, but what I'm saying is the intention is not always so obvious. It is subliminal. It is determined also by the way you want to see the world. Because the character was making remarks that went against the way I thought of people, somewhere in my subconscious, he succumbed to the violence of the day or whatever. But that was never my original intention to kill him. I was very surprised when I found him lying there. She's dead. Just saying.
Thank you so much, Aanchal and Janice. It was absolutely spectacular. And thank you everyone for being here, for taking the time out and being such a wonderful audience.